Hi, everyone. So good to see you all. I can see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. So just officially super excited to get us started on hopefully what will be a very open, real, honest discussion about a topic that I have been personally super interested in diving into, which is the metrics layer and what that actually means. So our goal today is to try and keep this. We actually don't have any pre-prepped content. Our goal today is actually to try and make this as interactive as possible and try and make this as real as possible as we can for the ecosystem. Super excited to join the two most, in my mind, knowledgeable people about this particular topic. So super excited to welcome Nick, the founder of Transform, and Drew, the founder of DBT, who've both been spending a ton of time thinking about the metrics layer. And so welcome, Drew, Nick, and excited to get started.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Excited to be here. Thanks for hosting.
So as we wait for folks to join, we actually wanted to do a quick poll just so we know who's in the room and get a sense of just like demographics and like the type of users we have in the room. So quick poll, like just tell us a little bit about, this is a little simplistic. It's really hard to like come up with 5 options for what it means to be in a data team, but hopefully you'll fit into one broad bucket here in some way. So any questions that you have, just please go into Q&A and keep adding it through the entire session, and we'll keep trying to like cover some of those as we go along. And so with that, any guesses on actually which role we have the most in the room? Drew, Nick, do you have any guesses? What do you think?
I'd probably guess data, either data analyst or data engineer.
Data analyst or data engineer. Okay. Nick?
I think that's probably right.
Yeah? Okay.
Probably more data analyst is my guess.
Data analyst. Okay. Can we show the results?
Whoa.
So 30% data leaders, which is awesome, and 29% data engineers. So it looks like data leaders won this one. So awesome. Cool. So I want to kick off with actually a really open but basic question to both Drew and Nick, which is, can we have like a simplified, like I'd love for you to like simplify this. There's a lot of confusion about what really is the metrics layer. So if I actually originally thought about framing this as like, if you were explaining this to a 5-year-old, and I figured you probably can never explain to a 5-year-old what the metrics layer is. So if you were explaining to like a beginner data analyst, what exactly is the metrics layer? Like, would love to just start with that.
You want to go first?
When you say 5-year-old, I'm thinking about like, if you wanted to count how many toys you have, it's like, first we got to, well, what's a toy? The shortest version of it I can think of is define your metrics once and reference them everywhere. So that if your metrics ever change, you get updated results everywhere you look at data.
I think that's pretty good. I think the way that I've explained it to family and just kind of people that are just totally out of the space is just businesses have data. They like to use that data to, basically measure their operations, kind of how things are going, understand it. And the point of, this software is basically to make it really easy for the data analysts, the people who are responsible for measuring that data, to define those metrics and make it easy for the rest of the business to consume the kind of single correct, way to measure that data.
And why is that important? What is the real problem that the metrics layer is looking to solve in this stack?
Okay.
Well, I think we're all pretty convinced of the value of data, right? And so I think that the point of this, in my mind, is that we have, all kinds of different interesting things that we can do with data. And the cost of doing those things is, fairly high, right? There's a bunch of work to kind of get the data into the place where we can go and we can make a line chart where we can, do anything that's like really interesting and useful. And so I think that, why does this matter? It's supposed to make that whole process of getting the data ready for that, kind of delivery of value much, much easier. and also more trustworthy. I think that it like comes down to those two things, productivity and trust. Like, is it easy to produce the metric, and is it the right metric? And can you put it in kind of the destination that you're trying to put it into for whatever application you're trying to serve?
Yeah, that's really good framing. Precision, trust. I just look kind of inwards at our organization, and I started working with Tristan and Connor, and it was just 3 of us. And the very first metric we ever created was weekly active projects. So it's how many DBT projects have been run in the previous 7 days. Now we're about 250 people, and we're doing objectives and key results, and we're measuring so many things across the business with lots of new people around, and trying to make sure that when someone says weekly active accounts or MRR split by managed versus self-service, that we all mean exactly the same thing. It's really that precision to me that sort of motivates the existence of this kind of layer in the stack.
And I'm curious in terms of just trying to understand like the state of metrics today, right? And I know we have like a lot of data practitioners in the house, and would love to, if there's anyone who would actually like to share your core challenges with metrics, we'd love to have you on stage. But would love to, while we have folks joining, like, as you thought about this problem space, like what is the state of metrics today, and why is it a problem? What does this mean in a day-to-day basis for data practitioners and data leaders? Like any stories around this state of metrics today inside organizations, and why that's broken?
I think it's one of the things that I would attribute it to is the data silos, right? I mean, there are as many data silos that you have, there would be as many departmental metrics. So really, if I think about metrics in the way we are talking about right now, I would think of it as an actual physical layer in your data reference architecture rather than a conceptual one. So it all goes down to, okay, if your data warehouse is supposed to be a single sort of source of truth, so does a metric layer, right? So from that perspective, I think instead of the more, again, going back to my point where as many data silos there are, is directly proportional to having the number of metrics for that department alone, instead of having a standardized set of it. That's what I would think of.
Thanks, Amit. Helpful. I can see a few others who have raised hands. Do you want to come up?
Hey, Prukalpa. Amit here.
Hi.
Hey, so all metrics are meant to measure something, right? For a business purpose, or what gets measured is what's important. So that alignment is one of the biggest challenges, I think, around metrics.
I think so much about the change management part of it, where if you get the right people together in front of a whiteboard or virtual whiteboard, you can precisely define a metric at that point in time. But inevitably your business or product or whatever it is will evolve. And then how do you keep it in sync in perpetuity? That's the hard part.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And especially when, that change management is happening when there are only a few people in the room, and then there are, just other people who are depending on those same metrics in other places who aren't a part of that conversation. Yeah, I mean, I definitely have some experiences to share around that.
Yeah. No, this is, I think we actually had someone say, I think we all understand the problem, which I think seems pretty clear from, so maybe we will actually, problem statement, I think is pretty clear, right? Like siloed, no one knows what definitions mean. We're all using different numbers, number on a dash, like, why is our ARR number wrong is like constant. I think we've all faced that challenge. So I think the problem seems pretty clear. And so we'll actually jump into some of the meat, right? Which is, would love to get a sense of what does as we think about the metrics layer, and I think I can see one major question from a lot of practitioners is, what does the interplay of the metrics layer really look like, right? Like we already have a bunch of different components in the data stack. What does it really mean to think about the metrics layer? How should we start thinking about the metrics layer and how it plays with other components of the stack, which could be BI, metadata, transformation, like all of those different layers. And I know we don't have all the answers yet, but would just love to get a sense of how we should start thinking about the metrics layer in vis-a-vis the broader stack.
So the way that I think about the metrics layer is basically kind of four pieces. So there are the semantics, like how do I go and define this metric, right? And this can range from here is a SQL snippet, this is the definition of the metric, to full semantic layer that has entities and measures and dimensions and relations and can kind of traverse the like data model of the warehouse in order to resolve different questions. And there's a big spectrum in there, and there are all kinds of different abstractions that can be chosen, and different semantic layers over time have done different kind of decisions in that space. Then there's performance. Like, great, now I have this semantic model. How do I go and build logic against this, execute it against some compute environment, whether it's a warehouse or just a compute engine on a data lake or something along those lines. Then there's, how do I query this thing? Like, what are the interfaces that I use to say, go and build that logic and pull it out of the data warehouse or out of the data lake, resolve it into this kind of, measure this, like this quantitative object that I can then go and use in some analysis. And, that includes kind of both just like broad ways of consuming data, like a Python interface or GraphQL or a SQL interface or something along those lines, as well as, direct integrations. So a tool that builds a custom, wrapper around a REST or a GraphQL API or something like that, and builds a really first-class experience. And then the last piece is governance. And I think that there's kind of like organizational governance and technical governance. Organizational governance meaning, does the finance leader agree on the definition of revenue? The philosophical, human understandable definition of revenue, in the same way that the technical, person who's going and defining the logic defines that code. So those are the kind of four pieces that I break the metrics layer into.
Yeah, right on. So just to provide like an alternate framing, we can think of it in terms of the experience for the person who wants to consume data to, answer some question or solve some problem. And then also like the people building the tools where the folks are consuming the data. And so it's a little bit at odds with each other, because the consumers, within the business who want to look at a line chart, like over time, they want to see the exact same metric in every single tool. And if they're using a sort of data catalog or data discovery tool, they want to see the exact same definition there, and they want it all to update in real time. And so you have this really giant, network of different tools that conceivably need to talk to each other. And that's sort of a hard thing to organize and make happen in practice. And so to me, that's why the idea that, we call this the metrics layer sort of makes sense. It is sort of a single abstraction layer that everything can interface with, so that you can get, precise and consistent definitions in every single tool. So I don't know if we want to go, deeper on the metadata parts of this now or later, but to me, that's where metadata really shines. It's like, this is the metric, this is how it's defined, this is its provenance, here's where it's used. Like, this isn't actually the data itself, it's attributes of the data. And that's sort of the sort of information that can synchronize all these different tools together around shared data definitions.
Yeah.
Just to add to that piece around metadata, the metric is like one of the most consistent objects in an organization's life. Like, every table, every, products change, tables change, like everything changes. Even the definitions of these metrics, like all of the logic that kind of leads up to them evolves. But, most businesses end up tracking the same kind of North Star metric from the very early days all the way into, the like later stages of that business's life. And if over that time you can attach metadata to it, like that is incredibly valuable. If you, and the example that I always think about is at Airbnb, we tracked, nights booked, super important metric. It was important from the very early days when BI was literally like a printed off graph that, they put on the wall at like the first office. and it's still the most important metric that the company talks about in public earnings calls. If we had been tracking annotations, like important metadata through time of what was happening to that metric, of different analysis that happened, there would be a wealth of knowledge that the company could use. And I think that some companies are starting to get to that place, but we're still pretty far off. And we need a consistent definition for the metric. We need like an actual object that we can tie these things to. It can't just be a SQL snippet in like a BI tool with no backend to kind of track any of that information.
Yeah. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, right? Like that Airbnb example, like what kind of metadata, if you were tracking at every stage of the life cycle of when that metric changed, like what kind of metadata would actually have been valuable? And what kind of problems would that actually solve from like a real life use case perspective for data practitioners?
Yeah, so I kind of think of two things. One is context, right? Like what happened to this metric at this point in time? Like, okay, I don't remember the date, April, like 20 something, 2016, like big product launch, different metrics spiked in all different directions. Like today, I'm not sure that a data scientist at Airbnb could like really understand what happened then, why that happened. But, people are looking at year over year trends. It's a seasonal business. They're trying to use historical, like past years of data to understand things. And they just don't have that context that goes that far back. If anything, they really only have context to the last like 2-3 years when there was somebody who's in the business who remembers what happened, who did the analysis, et cetera. And then the other piece is around kind of life cycle ownership, data problems, those kinds of things. So who's the owner? What tier is this metric? When was it defined? When did it evolve in different ways? Like when do we change the definition? Some kind of like connection to versions of metrics, et cetera. Can we even still calculate old versions of this metric? So these are the things that are kind of more around life cycle management of the metric. And then, the last piece is just kind of around data quality. Like, we missed like 8 hours worth of data on this day. It wasn't actually a bad day, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nick, the thing that you said that feels really resonant to me is there's a lot of this that ends up being technical in terms of how tools integrate with each other and how you define the metrics and version them. But so much of it is indeed like the social and sort of business context. And in practice, the people that have been around for the longest time have the most context and probably know more than any of our actual like systems do about why there was a big spike. And I can think about like we had like a period where we had a little bit of data loss for some events we were tracking, and it looked like, I think it was May 2021 was like the worst month ever, but really it was just like, we didn't collect the data. So how would you know that? Where does that information live? And do you annotate that at the metric level? Is it more of a property of the source data set that like propagates through to the metrics? And I don't know, like who's responsible for encoding that? Is that a data person, or is that, say it is something more like a product launch? Is it actually a PM or similar who goes in and says like, this is why we think this metric changed, or, here's the data that's actually anomalous, but it's a good and positive thing.
Yeah. I think that's also one of the reasons why I think it's important that the metrics layer interacts well with the data layer and with the context and the business layer. Like I think that integration, I know there's some questions which maybe we should take in a bit, but because even like going back into like lifecycle management, right? Like this number is wrong, or this metric, it doesn't seem right. That could be because we changed the metric definition. It could be because the data itself changed. So it could be like a data lineage upstream. Like there could be so many different things as you're thinking about this. The context is spread, the context between, and as you start like, for example, going public, like there are compliance teams, and like there's all these other kinds of teams that start getting involved, which when you're a small team is not necessarily, a challenge. And so I think that's why that interplay between one element of what does it mean to like, how do we define the metric such that it's, we can use the way I think about it, like you can use the metric in a bunch of different tools, and like what does that mean? But then how do you also look at all the other things around the metric, which is where knowledge and context and maintenance and connectivity to the data layer, I think all of those become super important. And so maybe with that, I can actually see a question from Amit, which is like, which is how should a data leader think about integrating with a current data reference architecture, right? Like, consider, what does that, like in practice today, what can we actually do? And how should we think about the pros and cons of that in some ways?
Well, I suspect that this will be a point of differentiation for Drew and I. I think we probably have different opinions, which we've talked a little bit about in the past. So maybe that'll be fun. So I think we probably agree on this, and that's just generally that, like, the metrics definition is the entire, set of data transformations that happen up until the point until it is like the unit of measure that we agree that we want to measure, right? Is that fair to say that we agree on that?
I'm sorry, I was trying to find the exact question. You're saying the data modeling plus the metric together are sort of the whole thing? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that, like, the point that maybe we will disagree on is that the like data modeling itself is extremely repetitive and like hard to manage. There are tons of joins and aggregations and filters, and like this is why we talk about applying software engineering best practices to the definitions of metrics, right? And to the entire like data modeling approach. We want to try and reduce and make our code as dry as possible. And so I think, the kind of architecture that that we've been advocating for, and that we've been seen be successful at Airbnb, was this approach where you build out your normalized data sets, your like canonical tables, your transactions, your users, like these kinds of things. You kind of build out like an ontology of all of the different, objects that your business has, with the entities, the, measures and dimensions, the relations between them. And then the point of the metrics layer is to sit on top of all of those data sets and programmatically build all of the SQL that does denormalization, that does the kind of roll-ups, that builds data marts. And then also to do the kind of construction of SQL on top of those data sets that you've then constructed. So that's kind of the architecture. And if you're thinking about building that, like, you would basically push your data to your warehouse, use dbt to do your normalization, you're kind of building out your canonical data sets. And then you would use a kind of more kind of complete semantic layer in order to construct your metrics off of those canonical data sets. And that could happen both ahead of time in the warehouse by building tables, or it could happen dynamically from a BI tool from all of these different places.
It is absolutely a blurry line between where the data modeling ends and the metrics begin. One of the things that we've seen that helped motivate our work on all things metrics is, we would talk to people who would basically build OLAP cubes in their warehouse with dbt, and then their BI tool would select star from some big table that pre-aggregated everything. And it's inefficient, it's inflexible, it's definitely not dry as it were. And so I think one of the things we're really excited to dig into and hear a lot of feedback from users on as we go deeper on metrics is where exactly this line between a metric and a model should be. Do you want a metric that has a very complex definition with a lot of filters and complex SQL, or should that actually be pushed down into the underlying data model so that you can reference it, not just for metric use cases, but for like exploratory analysis if you haven't defined a metric yet, or if you're trying to understand, some brand new data that hasn't really been tracked and modeled out yet. So it ends up being like a really interesting question, and I think we're still waiting to see what the best practices are that emerge. But for my part, I'm seeing that kind of thin metrics built on top of, this is what they would call it in the Ruby on Rails world, like fat models, ends up being kind of a good strategy, because you do end up putting a lot of the work into the underlying foundational data models. And then you can compose these things in different metrics in different ways to answer different types of questions.
So I guess maybe one thing I don't understand about that is, how are those like big fat tables different than OLAP cubes? You're just taking a bunch of measures, a bunch of dimensions, and then defining a roll-up on top of them.
They end up being like kind of fact and dimension tables rather. I mean, it depends on how you choose to model your data, but you wouldn't actually pre-aggregate things for the most part. If pre-aggregation helps you in creating a dimension, like when a user first did something and that has like general business appeal, then I think it, could be considered a best practice. But, we always tell folks not to try to do business intelligence in their DBT models. Like, don't actually do the analysis. Don't roll it up, because then you lose the dimensionality when you go to analyze it down the line. You can't filter if you've already aggregated,
So you're saying that these are fact and dimension tables, but aren't you joining fact and dimension tables to build those big wide tables? So they're not really fact and dimension tables.
It's true. And, I think we've seen a couple of different talks at our Coalesce conference where people either say like, only do Kimball modeling or never do Kimball modeling. And, every company tends to do this a little bit differently, but for us, we do create these sort of, marts that will join together data from different places and kind of give you a one-stop shop for, everything you need to know about customers or accounts or, in product activity. So yeah, there's an amount of sort of denormalization that happens there, but when it verges on actually like answering questions via these data transformations, then we think that's kind of where you draw the line and stop. It really is just the creation of dimensions from, events, basically, like when you first did something or in your lifetime, how many times you did something.
One of the biggest problems that I see with LookML and OLAP cubes and kind of all of these various technologies is that they ultimately, like, what you create is this constrained play box, like sandbox, right? Like you've got a few different measures, a few different dimensions. You can combine those things. They're already combined, right? Like they're already joined together. But then the moment that you want something that's outside of that, you're then kind of going and needing to add to this like giant wide table that has, probably like a ton of expression of SQL in order to kind of go and construct it. And it's just like kind of impractical. Like at some point you end up with needing to roll these tables up to lesser granularities in order to do analysis. And then you need to go and build other big wide tables that are at different granularities with like different dimensions in them. And now your end business user kind of has to choose between, do I go to this table or do I go to this table to answer my question? And now you have to define a different metric definition on top of one of those tables and on top of the other, or you have to find some way to like tie the logic together of these two big wide tables that ultimately have different sets of dimensions to go explore.
Yeah, that's interesting. This doesn't feel like a huge challenge to us in practice. We do a little bit abuse the Kimball terminology internally, but because it ends up being helpful. So we'll have, like a fact table that has joined in, a lot of other data sources to sort of give you everything that you need to know about, for us, let's just say a subscription, for DBT Cloud or a dimension table for an account. And so, yeah, there certainly is data coming from a lot of different sources that we're feeding into one sort of dimensional model. But the goal is really just that as a consumer of this data, you've got a table called dim users. It has, all the information you would care to know about users. And then certainly if you do want to go outside of that, outside of the things that are already kind of modeled out, then yeah, it's more of a bike trail than a paved road. But, this ends up being the big benefit of having a feedback loop in your data modeling. When new data does appear that is relevant, then you can actually take the time to incorporate it correctly to your data model. Whereas, there's always going to be a modeling step. Like, how do I incorporate this data set with this other data set? We can go deeper on the joins topic. Like I think I saw a comment in the chat, and also, oh sorry, do you want to?
There's a ton of questions that I'd love to like take some time to like go deeper into, right? Which is, for example, it feels like one question that people have. I can see a question from Karthik. I can see one from Shri, which is about like how, like in some ways, I think broadly, how much logical modeling should the metrics layer support? In some ways, in addition to being able to define the metrics, what is the logical transition for BI analysts and analytics engineers to start building reports and dashboards using a metrics layer or headless BI or whatever we think about, instead of what they're doing right now, right? And so I would love to like sort of just deep dive on this in terms of like actionably, how should people actually think about this, right? Because it is a pretty big change from the way we are operating now. And so how should people actually think about this?
We would probably say that, not every data point should or needs to be a metric. We think of metrics as being these, really pristine measurements of precisely defined business processes. We sort of anticipate that you would predefine the set of valid dimensions through which you can look at that metric. And it's sort of a reflection of, the idea that when you say revenue, you in most valid cases mean exactly one thing, and there's only a handful of valid ways to look at revenue. And if you start slicing and dicing by other arbitrary stuff, you might look at a valid and interesting number, but it sort of stops actually being revenue. It's now something different. So we don't anticipate folks defining thousands and thousands of metrics in their DBT projects for every metric anyone could ever want to look at. Instead, it's sort of the top level ones that are stamped as valid and approved and have significantly more rigor around change management.
So I think that this kind of ties to one of the questions that was sent over. Like, what do most people get wrong about the metrics layer? And I think that the metrics layer is this like evolving term. We're still figuring it out, et cetera. But if you look historically at the companies that have built this and have derived, a ton of value out of it, I think, the one that I'm most familiar with is Airbnb's, right, metrics repo, which became Minerva, which they've kind of talked quite a bit about. But there are other examples, like LinkedIn has one called Unified Metrics Platform. Uber has Umetrics. Like, these are companies that had a bunch of resources, so they went and built something. And if you look across those, like, what did the ones do that were really successful, and what did the ones do that kind of, flopped and didn't get much internal adoption? The kind of consistent pattern of what the really successful ones did is they were built on top of the nice, like, normalized data sets, not necessarily Kimball. Like, you can use any data modeling approach. You can have Data Vault, like, et cetera. There are tons of different approaches here that you could use, and companies choose different ones, and they have like raw messy data. But the consistent thing was that they basically chose as inputs these normalized data sets. They allowed you to go and define the relations between these data sets. And then they flattened the DAG and basically said, let's programmatically build data marts. And that's like effectively what Minerva was for the first, it's what metrics repo was for the first 3 years. It's what Minerva was for the first 3 years. Like, that is the tool that Airbnb got a ton of value out of. It wasn't until 2020 that Airbnb built this thing called Inquiry, which was the API. So it's a Python API on top of this interface that allowed you to consume these metrics and other tools. And so I think that people overemphasize the value of the connections to the downstream tools and underemphasize the like data engineering improvements that you get from not having these very, very large bloated DAGs with tons and tons of logic to manage across many layers of transformation.
And on that note, it feels like we can't do an event in 2022 and not talk about bundling and unbundling. And I can see a question from Etisham, which I want to take, right? Which is, does this need to be a separate, like, what is the purpose of this to be a separate layer in itself? Should it be a separate layer in itself? Should it be a Should it be part of an existing layer in the stack? Like, how do we feel about that?
So I'm actually on vacation this week. I'm in North Carolina. I hiked this morning on the Blue Ridge Mountain trails. And my whole purpose for this vacation was to get as far away as possible from someone saying the words bundling and unbundling. So vacation ruined. Thank you so much for that. I'm just kidding. No, it's a good question. I would just refer back to like, this is sort of the intermediary between all of the logic that fundamentally comes from your warehouse and all the different tools that want to consume that data and trying to give structure and sort of semantic meaning to that data. And so generally, I mean, I'll tell you, I'm not in love with the way that we as sort of an ecosystem talk about new tools as being layers, like the missing layer of the data stack. Like it feels like a cake with a finite amount of, there's only 6 things, we'll say, in the modern data stack. Like that's the wrong framing. People that build applications don't think about it that way. They have services and the services can talk to each other. And some are internal services, some are SaaS services. And it becomes a network of connected tools rather than no one runs an application anymore with exactly Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and LAMP stack, right? Like we're past that. So the word layer makes sense only insofar as it's like a layer of abstraction, I think. But otherwise, I a little bit reject the terminology, although I can't think of anything too much better than that. And the last thing I'm going to say is unbundling and unbundling. It just is so critical, like for this thing to work, it does need to be an intermediary between a very big network of different tools. And so sort of treating it as a boundary like that, to me, sort of motivates which kinds of tools can use it or can build it, provide it. And so it's like not something you would see from a BI tool, because it's not really in a BI tool's interest to provide the layer to every other BI tool, which is like sort of the thing that you want from this. And so it motivates which kinds of companies and products are well suited to build it.
I think I generally agree with that. I think that this is like more a question of, well, basically people have problems, right? And, companies build technologies to solve problems. And if people have problems and there is a valuable technology to build, then I think it's worth taking a shot and trying to build that technology and voicing those opinions. Ultimately, I think that there are good points there of kind of the connection to different like organizational workflows. This is not something that I think that we've done a good job of explaining, but I think that the metrics store and the metrics layer are 2 different concepts, where the metrics store kind of extends the metrics layer to include this like piece of organizational governance of how do you get a bunch of different business users involved in this conversation and like actually give them a role in something that frankly they have like a huge stake in. And I think that is something that, is just kind of like, it's not really caught in this conversation around the metrics layer or headless BI or like any of these different words, but it's really, really important. And when you look at when you look at companies that try and get some kind of sanity around their metric definitions, they tend to involve business users in some way, right? If it's like a Google sheet that just has, who's the person to reach out to and a description of the metric, or if it's like, anything else, right? They're an important part of this conversation. And so I would say that is something does make sense to connect to the technical governance and the technical kind of creation of metrics.
I think the answer to every debate in the data ecosystem is it depends. Like there is no other answer. Like I don't even know why we bother to do this, because everything is it depends on the perspective that you look at.
Well, Nick, I love that you started your answer with people have problems. Just like, yep, that's why we're here. That's what we're all doing.
Like we got to build, like people need to take shots at building things that solve people's problems. Like
on that note, I actually want to shift the conversation back to people's problems and use cases, right? Like real life use cases. I can see some questions on, I think Ben has a question on like, what are the use cases, right? Like should we think about metrics layers about supporting BI use cases, analytics, open-ended research, data science? Like what are the real use cases? Where is this most valuable? Is there a future where, we're not thinking about today, but there are like use cases that could be super valuable? Like, what is the, how do we think about this from a day-to-day use case perspective?
Okay. I think that some of the use cases around sort of BI and analytics are the most clear and obvious and sort of present for a lot of companies. There's a lot of companies, like very many companies out there that sort of are not at the data science and machine learning parts of their journeys yet, and just things that make business intelligence and reporting better, more precise, more consistent, cover 90% of the problems that they're trying to solve with data. I think that casting our minds forward, I think that there could be a ton of benefit to leveraging metrics for data science use cases. And so specifically, one of the things that we've seen people just do with DBT that was really formative for me is they would build these data models and then use them both for BI reporting and also to power data science applications and modeling. And so the fact that the data scientists and the BI analysts are using the same data sets means that it's a lot more likely that they sort of are consuming the same data in the same way. And so I think when you extend it to metrics, there's like a really natural way to make that happen too, in terms of trying to, classify or build a regression, things like that. Like you can use exactly the same definition that's going to show up in the chart in the dashboard.
I do partly agree with that, but I also there are a lot of kind of modeling and machine learning applications and just generally like data science things that require very different data sets than what a metric store produces. I worked for about a year and a half, 2 years on feature stores. And I think, we talk a lot about these two things. They're very different. Like they seem like they're the same. You're both, they're both kind of semantics and derived data. But probably the biggest and most important difference is analytics applications, you try and include as much relevant information as possible. Like, if you have a e-commerce store or something like that, and people can browse it logged out, right? You try and dedupe users and you identify as users log into devices. Like there's a whole kind of, practice of trying to figure out, which entities are using your service. And that is really, really important for analytics because it allows us to get a much clearer picture. But you don't want to do that for machine learning because that's all information leakage and that will ruin your models. And so I think with machine learning, you try and get as close to the raw data sets as possible. And with analytical applications, you try and process that information into the clearest and best picture of the world. So I think there are nuances there. There's also real time and all kinds of complexities. I think one of the application that I always think about is experimentation. Airbnb, the reason we built a metrics repo initially was experimentation. There were maybe 15, 20 people on the data team at the time. We were kind of trying to run more product experiments and we were doing everything manually. It was, really time intensive to go and take some assignment logs and some metric definitions that we had and join them together. And so we basically needed some programmatic way to go and construct metrics. Hugely valuable application for companies that do it, but also it's, an application that very few companies have the infrastructure or kind of build the tooling to do this. And I think that that's really, really unfortunate. And it's probably the thing that I'm most excited about the metrics layer just in general is that if you think about every data application as having, some cost and some reward, right? Some benefit, then the more you can reduce the cost to pursuing that application, the more clearly the justification becomes to pursue some new application that has some value, right? And so I think experimentation is one of the examples. I also think about anomaly detection or forecasting. These are things that I think most companies don't do, not because they're not valuable, but just because producing the data sets to even get started on those applications is really hard, really time consuming, doesn't justify the value that it creates.
Got it. So is it fair to understand that like right now, as we think about like metric store and layer, like we're closer to analytics than we are necessarily to data science and use cases like that? Are we in agreement on that? It seems like we are.
It depends. The classic answer. Like if it's machine learning, I think that, you can do like offline batch, machine learning on these kinds of data sets. And like, you have to be really aware of the like nuances of, am I including feature leakage or some of those kinds of, problems.
Yeah.
But if it's, hey, I just want to go and, join some tables and do a stats test or do like a regression to see if these things are related to each other, then I think that there is kind of valuable statistical analysis that you can do. And so in that way, it is useful for data science. I just think that the bulk of the applications are actually related to analytics and like the end business user and how they're consuming these metrics.
Makes sense. We have 9. So just one quick shout out. I'm really sorry for dismissing the product questions. We're really trying to like avoid product related questions here and keep this as a true community event in some ways. So really sorry for those. We'll follow up on any specific questions on email or other channels on any specific product related questions. We have 9 questions to go. So we're going to like try and rapid fire this in 9 minutes. So there's one that seems to have a ton of upvotes, which is about the caching layer from Martin, which is, do you believe a caching layer is critical for a metric layer, or is it nice to have? How should we think about the caching layer? One of you want to take that?
Yeah, I think that the speed with which you can, ask a question and get an answer back is really critical. The difference between something taking, a minute plus to come back and not coming back at all is kind of negligible in a lot of cases. So just conceptually, I'm very aligned with the idea of caching metric data and being able to serve it up really quickly. I will just say, and I think we've been open about this in the past, like we probably won't do that for V1 of metrics within dbt, but conceptually, I'm pretty aligned with that being an important part of the system long-term.
Yeah, caching is super important. Performance matters a ton, especially to business users. They want things in, even 10 seconds is like a less than ideal experience. I think that there are 2 important kind of, nuances to caching. One is, what do I know ahead of time that I want? And how do I pre-compute that and make that really, really snappy? And then if I do compute something, how do I then reuse it so that it's fast next time? And I think that that's kind of the point of a caching layer. The other one is, I don't think that caching needs to happen outside of the cloud data warehouse or the data lake. Like, I think that you can use those systems. I don't think that most use cases rely on like Druid or something like this. The replication of data in my mind is, just so costly and so hard to manage.
It does get hard because you don't want to roll up on a lab cube and say like, okay, we built caching. Like doing it intelligently is it's a hard problem.
And once you stuff those like big wide tables into those layers, it's over, right? You've limited the number of questions you get to ask.
So going from there into something a little bit more meta, we have a question from Aggie, which is, what strategies would you recommend to companies going through mergers and acquisitions or business transformations when there are so many systems and processes and journeys which all need to be considered?
Gosh, what a good question.
I think this kind of touches on like the decentralized versus like centralized, definitions of data. Part of the value of this is like, if you are going through these, mergers or acquisitions, the ability to kind of have your definitions and have the other definitions and freely consume them across boundaries. Like, I hate to say it, but data mesh is like, kind of an interesting thing here. Like, you can have these separate kind of, consumption planes. But yeah.
Nick, I'm with you. I want to embroil us in data mesh, but I was thinking about it earlier. It comes into like, whose responsibility is it to make sure that these things are consistent? And especially, when you think about a merger acquisition, okay, day one, you basically have 2 different products and companies that have just, joined together. But over time, these things are going to more deeply merge. And so making sure that the right people on the teams that are like changing how the software works and how the business operations work, making sure that they're empowered to like control and update these metrics, and the right people are involved at the right time. It's my guess at how you do this well.
Yeah. So basically, I think we're thinking about like most domain-based teams or like specific teams that can adopt this slightly differently until eventual consolidation. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, you basically have two different data stacks, and you're trying to create like clean APIs so that people can consume off of them, which is kind of what the metrics layer is for either of them.
I can see one on the feature store, which has like a ton of, and I know we touched on this a little bit, so we can decide if it makes sense. But like Piyush actually has, a strong opinion on feature stores, and does like can metrics layer not just be a part of like a feature store? Does it need to be a separate tool?
Yeah. Okay, so I have a really strong opinion about this one because I've built 2 feature stores and 3 metrics layers, and that is that these 2 things are totally different. Like at the core, they are derived data, but there are so many nuances to building feature stores and so many nuances to building metric stores. I'm not saying that these 2 things will never merge. Like the idea of a derived data repository or something like that sounds so wonderful, but I just don't see it happening in the short term. Core reasons are like everyone wants features to be specific to their model. Nobody wants like metrics to be specific to their like team or their like consumption, right? People want metrics to be consistent. People want features to be unique and like whatever benefits their model. Like real-time versus batch, super, super hard, super challenging problem in the feature store space. There are a bunch of other ones. Like the organizational governance is way important for the metrics layer. The like technical definitions are often different. The like level of granularity is different for features. You go way finer with features than you do metrics. So anyways.
Yeah, I built 0 feature stores and approximately 1 metrics layer. So I think, Nick, you're a lot better suited to respond to that one than I am. I would say that intuitively, I kind of like we talked about earlier, BI and analytics makes a ton of sense for metrics. Data science, right on the cusp. ML is a little bit outside of my ken, I think.
All right, so we'll rapid fire these. Is metrics layer meant to replace data marts? Clean layer of data warehouse lake, both coexist with them or replace?
I'd say coexist.
I think coexist, yeah. Metrics layer is supposed to build data marts, in my opinion.
Okay. For a traditional BI shop that relies on a data warehouse, could we understand where the metric store sits in the stack? Like if a company already has a BI layer and it already has a data warehouse, then what happens with the metrics layer?
So metrics layer sits on top of the data warehouse, basically wraps it with like semantic information, and then allows different endpoints to be consumed from, and basically pushes metrics to those different places, whether they're generic or direct integrations to those tools.
Yeah, it ends up being very BI tool dependent. There are some BI tools where this is a very natural type of thing to do, and others where it's actually pretty unnatural. Yeah. And
is there like if there's a company that's already defined a ton of things in their BI tool, then what happens? They migrate. How are you? Is that?
I would advocate for like not a huge change everything all at once. I would advocate for define some metrics, like push these through, the APIs, the integrations, like connect, build something new, potentially replace something old that was hard to manage, and then kind of go from there once you've seen how it works and like believe in that philosophy.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think something domain driven makes a lot of sense. Yeah. You can validate it and then expand. And I'd probably start with like, it depends on your tolerance, but like the executive dashboard that goes to the CEO. Like, okay, is that the best place to kick the tires? Maybe not, but if it works there, it'll work everywhere.
Awesome. Great. I know we're at time, so I want to ask you both one question, and then if you're around to hang around for a little bit, and if attendees are around to hang around for a little bit, we can actually get some more questions. But one last question. outside of the metrics layer and store and metadata and all of this, if you were handed a megaphone and you could blast out a message for the entire data world to hear, what would you say?
I think we touched on this earlier. There's a lot of problems in data that you can solve with technology, but some of the hardest and most important ones you must solve with conversations and people and alignment and sometimes whiteboards. And sort of knowing which kind of problem you're trying to solve at any given time is going to help you pick the right kind of solution.
You said outside of the metrics layer?
I mean, you could also.
Okay. I mean, I think like the metrics layer thing is just, it is basically a semantic layer with an additional concept of a metric, which is super important, super, like we talked about the relevance to metadata, all these kinds of things. So I would just say metrics layer should be backed by a general purpose semantic layer. And the spec and the definition of that semantic layer and the abstractions is so unbelievably important.
All right, awesome. I know we're over time, so just a quick one on for anyone who needs to leave. We have a survey. Please give us like some metrics about how we just did. So please fill in the survey if you need to drop. That would be awesome. Drew, Nick, how are you on time? Like, do you guys actually have time? I can see like we actually have some attendees hanging around. So do you have time or do you have to jump?
I already told everyone I'm on vacation, so I got nowhere to be in all day to get there.
I can hang around.
All right. Do you want to actually take like, maybe we hang around for like five more minutes and actually answer?
Yeah.
I can see one from Alan. Is a byproduct of the metrics layer that data analysts will interact more with data engineering teams and practices?
So if you take this idea that, you should basically be constructing nice, clean, normalized tables, I think potentially that's the role of like the data engineer, the analytics engineer. Like they define these nice, clean interfaces for the rest of the company to consume from. And that then becomes this like clean handoff for when the person, the analytics engineer, data analyst type functions can pick up on those definitions and define their metrics on top of them, and then kind of programmatically build these like data marts that they would like to consume from. So in my mind, it's more about defining a clearer boundary between their work and kind of a clearer like point of collaboration than it is about, who does like more of what kind of work.
Yeah, I think on the topic of collaboration, one thing that feels a little bit unsolved is how and when folks from the business get involved and talk to the data engineers and the data analysts, and like what the means of communication are there. If it's like Slack messages that say this looks funny, or emails or similar, or like, is that actually a more programmatic way of talking about and changing a metric? So I feel like data analyst, data engineer, like, I don't want to say they're totally solved problems, but like we're kind of increasingly converging around sort of shared responsibilities. Business person, I feel like is sort of not brought into the system completely correctly yet.
Awesome. Question from Anant. How do you differentiate the metric layer API interface from the database custom UDF and UDAF API interface? Is it comparable? If not, how are they different?
I'm really intrigued by, are they called vector UDFs? Is that right? You can make like a UDF that returns a table. I think there's actually a pretty cool opportunity to do something like returning metrics there. And I think I saw some support for it in one of the popular data warehouses recently. But besides that, I feel like it's a neat way to actually execute the queries that need to be executed potentially, but actually isn't like a solution to the problem of governance and definitions and change management. It's just a tool.
Yeah, I think there's a thing called table generating functions. I think it's Snowflake. And we basically designed our JDBC to like replicate that. And this kind of goes to that point around like the metrics layer should be able to build like data mart type tables, because then what you end up with in your JDBC is like, let me just go and generate this data mart with these metrics and these dimensions. and then you can write whatever SQL you want on top of that.
Awesome. Back to metadata. Considering the metadata of a metric, once you break it down by different dimensions, the amount of content metadata that needs to be added gets enormous. How would a metrics layer deal with that?
That doesn't feel intractable to me. I think that when you're sort of building data systems, I guess maybe what I should say is like, I've definitely learned over time that the size of the metadata can become enormous, and the query access patterns for the metadata are very different than the data itself. So I always think about like Snowflake's information schema and how challenging it was to consume it for a little bit. I'm sure they have just like an immense amount of purely metadata sort of in their cloud services layer. So I don't know, I think you have to engineer for that in particular to be able to collect and index and serve up all that metadata in sort of interactive response times.
I think that, this metadata evolves over time, and I'm not sure that it makes sense in kind of like basically in Git or like version control. So I would kind of just think about this as like, a production database for an application. Like, what kinds of information do you want to store? And like there should be a backend basically to tie information to metrics. Like there's ways that you can stuff this into, the APIs or something like that. Like, we've played around with the idea of making it so that our API can return like annotations with the data that it's returning. And that's useful, but by no means are you going to be able to kind of return all of the important metadata or like attach it to tables or something like that. So I think there needs to be like a proper backend. And then ideally there's like an actual metadata API that allows you to pull that metadata into various other tools.
All right, awesome. We'll end with one last question and close for a day. You mentioned North Star metrics. Do business stakeholders directly contribute to the metrics layer? And if so, how?
Like in practice in the business, are they interacting with
the metrics
the
layer?
metric definitions?
Are they interacting with just the outcome?
Oh.
I would not be interacting with the outcome. They're just like, yeah, the number looks the way it should.
For, in the very early days of DBT Labs, we modeled ourselves after like GitLab a whole lot as a very successful distributed company. And one of the things we try to do is say, all of our documentation is going to be in version control, and everybody needs to like use Git to update the docs about like company handbook, stuff like that. That lasted until we were about 25 people. And then we sort of said, okay, like we'll use Notion or whatever. I do not anticipate people from the business going into, YAML files or SQL files or whatever kind of files under version control and defining these things themselves. But I think that structure around how and when people from the business and people from data teams get together and talk about these metrics, and like whether it's a push versus pull, like whose responsibility is it to talk about when a metric's changing? Like we're launching a new product, we need to make sure that revenue incorporates revenue from this new product stream, whatever it is. There's a different billing system, whatever it is. Is it on the data analyst to go pull and ask? Is it on the business person or product manager or whoever to push and say like, hey, this is new and different, let's prioritize it? I don't think there's a single right answer, but if there isn't a collaboration there, it's not going to go well.
So the technical definition of a metric, like I don't see how, somebody without the context of the underlying tables and like how that data is created could really kind of get involved in that definition, unless there are really, really clean interfaces to like explain what is in the warehouse and then allows you to kind of define something on top of that. And I think that it just depends on how complicated is the metric. Like, is it, some like, set of event logs and you're trying to define a conversion metric between them and you need to know the nuances of like those, event logs, like probably not going to be defined by a business user. Is it, a nice clean transactions table and I just want to define a count star on it? Potentially a business user could define something like that. So I think it's more about through the APIs, like what kinds of additional functionality do you put in the hands of the business user that they're capable of defining? So like, is this I want to take the revenue metric, but I want to look at it week over week or something like that. That is something that I think a business user can kind of take an existing metric definition and extend it and manipulate it in kind of, minor ways.
Cool. Prukalpa, this is a lot of fun. Nick, it was good talking to you about all this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much, Drew. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for joining today. I can see a bunch of questions about our DBT and versus transform going to converge and diverge. So we're actually going to leave you all at the edge of your seats. You're going to have to wait for answers to that one. But thank you so much for joining. You all remind me of just how much I love the data community every day. This has been a great conversation. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. Super fun.
Thanks everyone. It's a lot of fun.